want to ask you a little bit more around your work. I love your work as a global health disrupted, and I think it's exciting to look at. It's supposed to be a grassroots movement that's been looking at cultivating local leadership. So again, moving on the discussions around leadership and how to sort of bring different voices and strengthening engagement at the local level. What do you see as some of the solutions and strategies for improving diversity, particularly in this field and the work that you're doing?
Thank you, Nana. So actually, I will try and answer this question using a few hats that I wear, especially this global health disrupted work. But the other hats that I wear, I'm an academic at UCL at the Institute for Global Health, and I work with the Centre for Gender and Global Health and the Centre for Global Health Economics. I started my professional career as a medic in very rural Australia and then very rural Peru. And on that note, alongside Holly, I'd like to extend my recognition of the Indigenous elders and the leaders that I have worked with, and from the lands that I grew up with and from the lands that I've worked on since then. So Global Health Disrupted is an international grassroots movement. We actually take quite creative and very community, small-scale approaches to health, and we combine arts and science to improve health and foster local leadership. And one of the things that my colleagues and I have come to realise is the importance of narrative and the importance of stories, because that is what connects us to what is human. And when it comes to issues as complex as health behaviours, capturing that narrative is so important. We're here today because we're wanting to change the narrative around women in science, medicine and global health, because narratives matter. And reflecting from more activist grassroots work back up to academia, we see that in academia, every paper that we publish, all the work that we do, it tells a story, and it is so important to get that story right. And what does that mean? Well, I was reflecting on the author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's warning to us of the danger of a single story. And I'm so glad we spoke about intersectionality on this panel, because the danger of a single story is that we are, when we only hear one thing or one representation in common discourse, it leads us to believe possibly dangerous or make possibly dangerous misperceptions. And the evidence that has been presented here and within the Lancet Women theme issue shows us of the danger of this single or this partially told story to health the world over. It has grave consequences, whether it makes women the other or completely invisibilises marginalised groups, and that has to change. So what can we do? Well, I would like to argue for greater critical engagement for all sciences, for all scientists in biomedical and public health science. And what does critical engagement mean? Well, at least for me, it means positioning the research in the context of cultural and political and ideological structures that drive our science. And beyond that, also positioning yourself as a researcher, recognising your own bias, and overcoming this artificial divide between distance and impartiality when we do science. And I think Ed spoke to this earlier about embracing the bias that we bring to the table. So back to a more academic approach, and Jocelyn and Richard mentioned this earlier, that the process of doing the Lancet Women theme issue has been transformative. And I truly believe that the research process itself can be transformative. And an example that Anuj spoke to was participatory research. And it's something that we are trying to do as best we can with Global Health Disrupted, where we involve communities who are traditionally the researched in as an integral part of the research process, from the designing of the question to the analysis of the data. And that allows us to transform community realities, but also transform systems of power. So I guess when you ask what are the solutions, to me it boiled down to three main points. The first is considering, when you do tell the story, considering what that story is and whether that is the whole story. And presenting stories that challenge that dominant discourse, particularly in terms of who is in power and who is not. And secondly, leading on from that is to think about power always. And that's where I think the Lancet Women theme issue gives us an opportunity to not just talk about women in science and medicine and global health, but to talk about gender and to talk about power. And what I see as the greatest opportunity here when we do talk about gender equity is that it is good for everyone. It's not just a women's issue. It is so important to us as women, but it is an issue for women, men, and gender diverse people. And instead of being a divisive force, I actually think it is one of the potentially the greatest unifying force out there. So I hope that is a call for all my feminist colleagues.
Thank you very much. Geordan, you brought in elements around power dynamics, and I think when we're looking at the whole issues around leadership, power really comes in, looking at both invisible and hidden forms of power, different elements around power. But what's really good is the whole narrative that you've also been talking about, whose narrative, and really trying to get the whole story. One of the things that's been quite exciting recently has been looking at how academics partner with civil society, and I think that's an element that hasn't also come up in conversations here. And I think from where I'm coming as civil society, we need to build more of these connections and linkages better, because that also helps to get the whole story. And particularly where there are new initiatives where you're looking at training institutions, particularly medical institutions, linking up with charity sector, is really helping to reveal and understand better multiple forms of challenges and identities. I think I'll now open the floor for a few